Okay. So this is week 9, chapter 8. It's on reform of social movements. The next chapter will be on revolutionary social movements. This is still section 3 of this book I'm using, Processes of Social Change. This is going to be about social movements based on social class and social status. After, let's see, and then there are chapters on technology, the environment, and globalization. That will be next. So, slide 36, I'm going to skip. Slide 35, this is in a section on social and historical context of social movements. Okay, so what it says here basically. Okay, so I will let you read that. Slide 34. So this section is on social class movements. And again, I will let you read what is there. Slide 33. This is on agrarian social movements. Slide 32. Oh, this is on the labor movement or labor movements. Slide 31. This is on the progressive movement. So these are all social movements from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Slide 30. You may wish to pause the video and read these two, maybe have the slides with you and the video while you're doing this. Okay, so this is the section on movement impacts or the consequences of social movements, slide 29. Skip slide 29. For me, I mean, read it, but there's nothing else for me to say here. Trying to do this. I usually have notes with me, but I did not do much in the way of notes today, so we'll see how this goes. Slide 28. This is the section on status movements, by which they mean things like race and gender. Basically, everything that is not a social class thing. Although, of course, as we know, race and gender are social class things. There is a racial wage gap. There is a gender wage gap. These are so-called bread and butter issues. Slide 27. They are using a neo-Weberian taxonomy to categorize social movements in this chapter. I'm not sure why, but that comes from Max Weber, his work on class status and party. But anyway, I guess because Marx does not write that much about race and gender, although what he writes is significant and important. But anyway, the civil rights movement is what this is on. Slide 26. Skip. I'm going to skip it anyway. Slide 25. I'm going to skip that one as well. But you should probably read it for yourselves. This is taken from a textbook chapter that is probably, 50 pages, and each slide is there's probably 3 slides per page. So I reduced it to just what we should take what is on the quiz and background information that would be useful, maybe. Slide 24, the New Left and countercultural student movements. I take it this is focusing on the anti-Vietnam War movement and the free speech movement at places like UC Berkeley in the 1960s and 1970s. Slide 23. So again, this is not related to this slide per se, but the new left and the countercultural movement is what this is all about. Slide 22. I'm going to skip that. Slide 21, the feminist movement. Okay, yeah, so read that. or again, the feminist movements. There have been several waves of feminism, first, second, third, that focus on things like women's suffrage or voting rights, and then later on, things like reproductive rights, jobs, education, and then later on, things like global feminism, lesbian feminism, black feminism. Slide 20. So slide 20. I mean, I have to mention here. So I guess The Feminine Mystique was the book written by Betty Friedan. And then Simone de Beauvoir, the French second wave feminist, wrote The Second Sex. That was her book. Two important philosophical and feminist writers and books in second wave feminism. So 1940s to 1970s or 60s. Slide 19. Maybe this lecture will not take too much time today, I hope, because I know for everyone, for me and for you, that's a lot of, we only have so many minutes and hours in the day. Slide 19 is other status equality movements. I guess this is just everything else, like the environmental movement in the 1970s and the LGBTQ plus movement in the 1970s. I mean, in the 1970s, it was just the gay rights and lesbian rights movement. Basically, the trans rights movement came much later, although there were always trans people involved in these movements who may or may not have identified as gay or lesbian. The terms and the scholarship comes later after the activism. Then there's theory that's applied to it. Slide 18. So it does mention the Hispanic, Asian, and Native American social movements as well. Today we have critical race theory, which is mostly for African American people, although it applies to other groups as well, and there are subgenres of critical race theory. So there's Latin crit or Lat crit about Hispanic Americans, there's Asian crit or even Desi crit about Asian and Indian Americans, Native or Indigenous crit, or First World Nations crit theory, critical theory, and so on and so forth, which is extremely provocative stuff to read, because like all critical theory, the civil rights movement is based on the idea of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence. All people are created equal. And it tells a progressive story about slavery and the Civil War and segregation and the civil rights movement. Critical race theory suggests that racism is a permanent feature of American society as it's been constructed, and that forms of repression have changed, but repression itself has not changed. So, for example, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act have all been overturned now, basically, right? Or let me use an example here. So, slavery ended, but then there was the convict lease program during Reconstruction in the 1870s, in which Black men and women were arrested for things like loitering or disorderly conduct, and then they would be leased out by jails and prisons to work as free labor on plantations where they had been slaves. And then, we got the civil rights movement. We had Jim Crow segregation, which did things like prevent people from voting who were African Americans. But then we got the war on drugs, which incarcerated African American people, nonviolent offenders. There are more people in prison today than were ever enslaved in the United States, and more Black people in prison today than were ever enslaved in the United States. Prisoners are exempt from the slavery clause in the 13th Amendment, so they can be forced to work for little or no money. And remember, felons, even drug felons, may not have the right to vote. You can discriminate legally against them in jobs. They may not be able to apply for public benefits or public housing. You can discriminate against them in housing. So, isn't it interesting that it has affected that community, the African American community? And you all know the statistics. There was that research done in Detroit. It's a few decades old now, but that found that white uh, men with a criminal record received more job interviews than did black men without a criminal record. And today, frankly, we have a white man in the White House who is a convicted felon, whereas the person he ran against, Kamala Harris, was a prosecutor. She's a lawyer and was a state attorney general for California prior to being in the U.S. Senate. So there are those examples of continuing racism and sexism. Slide 17. Um, it goes back here. Whoops. It goes back here to political opportunity theory and relative deprivation theory and resource mobilization theory from social movement theory in the previous chapter to kind of apply those theories to these social movements if they can. Slide 16. So, political opportunity. People got the right to vote, women, people of color, especially in the 1960s. Relative deprivation. World War II provided jobs to women and people of color, although the armed services were still segregated. We all know about Rosie the Riveter, that famous poster, women working in factories, building, war vehicles, because men were off fighting the war, World War II. But then when the male GIs came home, the female factory workers had to go, and they resented this. And African American people who were veterans who had served their country, and could not eat at a lunch counter resented that as well. So, improving conditions as well as deprivation, material and symbolic deprivation can cause social movement formation. We also had the political realignment that it mentions here. So the 1960s and after that, the Republican Party was for segregation, basically. And the Democratic Party was against segregation. But before the 1960s, it was the reverse. So the political parties changed, mainly because of Presidents Kennedy and Presidents Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. So that's the political realignment they mention here. Slide 15. Slide 14. I guess I'll just go to that. I'll skip 15. What is this about? I'm not sure why I wrote this here. Okay, but then in the 1970s, things change. Um, there's retrenchment or contraction of things like voting rights, jobs, the television media that had covered the civil rights movement so that people all over the world and in the northern United States would know more about it also changed. We got cable news media, reality television, social media that was corporately controlled, and that although TV was corporately controlled too, but that was not as friendly to the social justice movements. And the economy since the 1970s takes a turn for the worse, with prices being high, wages being low, outsourcing of jobs because of globalization and trade deals, and so on and so forth. And then around this time, we get other things like, the new Jim Crow, new So, for example, in the southern United States today, to repress the black vote, there are not enough polling sites in black communities, and there are rules placed on them, like you may not get out of line even to go to the bathroom, you may not carry a bottle of water with you in line, and so on and so forth. Slide 13. Stacey Abrams is an African-American lawyer and politician from the southern United States who's documented this in her interviews and books and writings and podcasts, by the way. Let's see. So this is the new right and cultural conservatism, and they mention, well, let's see, let's go to slide 12. I mean, we already mentioned the new right, well, basically the new and the old rights and left, right? And we mentioned, the old was more about economic conservatism and liberalism, and the new is more about cultural, cultural. What am I trying to say here? Basically, I'm trying to say both the new and the old. Okay, what am I trying to say here? The new right and left tend to be about cultural issues. The old right and left tend to be about economic issues. Although, to be honest, they're still about both today. Not much has changed. Slide 11. I mean, there is continuity here. I mean, the old right was, for slavery and for segregation, and the new left, so the old and new right, I guess I should say, and the new and old left, has been and is for the abolition of slavery and civil rights. So there's actually, I don't know about that much change, but slide 10. Okay, so this is about the religious right, and this reminded me that there is a connection, certain scholars and journalists suggest, between segregation and abortion rights movements, or I should say pro-segregation movements and anti-abortion movements. So if you're curious about that, there's this video on YouTube. It's an MSNBC video. It's by this person, Ali Velshi. He's the commentator on it, although other people are cited. It was 2022. It's called "For Religious Right, Abortion Was a Means to Power as Segregation Lost Political Potency." It's a fascinating video if you're curious about it. It's about 10 minutes long. It has chapters too. This gives you more information on the religious right and on the kind of new right, I guess. What else? I've already lectured a lot this term, so maybe no one will care if this video is about half the amount of the others. Slide 9. Excuse me. What is this? Oh, okay. There's a book here by the late NYU historian named Tony Judt called "Ill Fares the Land." That quote, by the way, comes from an Irish poet named Oliver Goldsmith, and the quote is, "Ill fares the land to hastening ills of prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay." This book is about the history of social inequality. It's a fascinating book, although unless you are interested in economic inequality, it may not interest you. But I will just tell you, having read it, what might be of interest today with everything that we are mentioning and that's in this chapter too. So he mentions that during the Great Depression, the United States went basically towards socialism and democracy with the New Deal and with the British economist John Keynes and his ideas. Um, yeah, and that was the lead up to World War II. But then in Germany, in places like Germany, they went towards capitalism and ultimately fascism before World War II to get out of the Great Depression. And there was an Austrian economist named Friedrich von Hayek who was famous for that. Um, what is interesting, according to Judd, is that in the 1970s, this changed. All of a sudden, Germany started to go towards social democracy in the post World War II era, and the United States started to go more towards capitalism in the post World War II era. And he suggests this is where the resulting fascism is coming from today. Slide 8, or well, actually, hang on. Is there anything else I should say about that? Oh, well, I will go to slide 8, but I'll mention this too. This slide is redundant, so not redundant, so not about this slide, but that book also did a lot to convince me that economic equality and gender and racial equality um, go together. Mainly because the more economic security a person has, the more conditions for women and people of color also improve economically, but also it leads to freedom, more freedom of expression, especially for people that may be gay or trans or whatever. So for example, with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it starts with, you know, basic security and then goes to other things like self-actualization and love and belonging and career satisfaction. So that's interesting. Although in the book, this book, Tony Judd, he's sort of he's actually against that idea, but he plays devil's advocate, and ironically, he actually I kind of borrow his mental engineering here. I use his premises, but I don't use his conclusions. Anyway, slide. What else? I guess slide 6. Well, let's see. Yeah, no, slide 7. Slide 7. Okay, so they the chapter conclusion. What is this about? Well, what does it say here? Okay. So yeah, in Marxism in the 1970s, there was this thing about how do the rich control politics, basically through economics. One is called instrumentalism, the idea that the rich just use money to control the government because a lot of rich people are in the government or donate to political campaigns or whatever. Um, and based on this idea, social reform movements are good because we get things like the social safety net and the welfare state. However, there's another view which is called structuralism. And this is the idea that whatever is good for the establishment and the status quo is good for capitalism because it's a capitalist society and system. And so, from this point of view, reform social movements are bad because they just put a band aid on things. They don't change anything. They preserve capitalist exploitation by giving concessions to the people and the workers, like the welfare state and the social safety net. Um, let's see. And that, absent a revolution, nothing will ever change. So those are two interesting points of view. Slide 6. Again, does history take 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, or 2 steps forward, 2 steps backward? So, again, the civil rights movement and critical race theorists would debate and discuss that. Whoops, slide 5. Oh, okay, so let's slide 4. So, summarizing potential consequences and impacts of social movements and social change. So there can be cultural changes in norms and mores. For example, before the 1960s, prejudice and discrimination, attitudes and behaviors against racial and ethnic minorities was normal and acceptable. And then after the 1960s, it was not as normal or as acceptable for a while. But today, I would suggest it's normal and acceptable again. White supremacy and white nationalism have become mainstream again. Slide 3, law and legislation. So, for example, in 1973, Roe v. Wade was a Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion and made it a constitutional right in all states, although states could restrict it. And then almost exactly 50 years later, we got the Dobbs v. Jackson decision in 2022 by the Supreme Court, which said there is no constitutional right to abortion, that states may completely ban it or not. So, yeah, it waxes and wanes and it changes, but yeah, social movements can have an impact, right or left, Slide 2, is this? Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, so yeah, so there can be the creation of new organizations, such as social movement organizations or government agencies and departments. So, for example, again, we had agencies and departments that were related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but now they are all being changed to merit, excellence, and intelligence. So things come and go, they change. There's right and left social movements, and that's in corporations, the governments at federal, state, and local levels. That is also Stan State University. Yeah. Slide 1. There can also be social and structural change, although whether or not political and economic change go together is another story, because there are groups like African Americans who have experienced improvements politically in terms of voting rights, but not economically, even though there are a few wealthy Black Americans, and even though there is a new Black middle class that did not exist before of college-educated professionals, still there has not been that much change overall. African Americans are still disproportionately represented in poverty, although based on total numbers, the majority of poor people and the majority of people on public benefits are white. Whereas, okay, what about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders? They have experienced economic improvements. The college graduation rates for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is 50%. So that is higher than for whites and higher than the average, which is 30% about for both. So yeah, but no political power with that. Not much anyway. Although we did just have, Kamala Harris is of Black African descent and of Asian Indian descent. So, and she just ran for president. But still, there's not been a change there. I would say, not to mention, for example, the gender wage gap for Hispanic Americans is 60 cents on every dollar a white man makes. The gender wage gap for Asian American women is what is it? About 90 cents on every dollar a white man makes, which seems good, but keep in mind, many of those Asian American women have master's degrees, PhDs, so they are still being prejudiced against, discriminated against, just at a higher level of education, and they are still not being paid what they're worth. Anyway, I guess that's it for today. Thanks.